The morning in the city courthouse began like any other. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of coffee, old books, and the faint wax polish that gave the place a quiet dignity. Inside the courtroom, people murmured softly as they found their seats. Lawyers organized papers, court clerks shuffled documents, and the occasional sound of a gavel striking echoed in the hallway as cases began elsewhere. Judge Robert Hayes sat behind the bench, a figure of calm authority. His robe hung perfectly on his broad shoulders, and his eyes scanned the docket with practiced ease. Today was another busy day, full of cases ranging from minor thefts to more serious disputes. Robert had been a judge for over 15 years. He had seen hundreds of defendants, countless witnesses, and an endless parade of stories. Justice was a serious business, but he had always believed it must be tempered with understanding and humanity. As he reviewed the docket for the day, one name caught his eye: Michael Turner. Robert blinked and frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar, but that was impossible, he thought. Michael Turner could not be someone he knew. Judges do not allow personal connections to interfere with the law. And yet, as the courtroom doors opened and the defendant was led in, Robert felt his heart skip a beat. The young man standing before him was tall but thin, wearing a standard jail-issued outfit. He looked nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he fidgeted with the edges of his sleeves. His face was familiar, though different now, older, more serious, hardened by life. And then it hit Robert. The eyes, the shape of the jaw, the way he held himself, all of it brought back a flood of memories. This was Michael, his childhood friend, the boy who had been his closest companion for years. Robert took a deep breath and forced himself to remain calm. He could not show this reaction. The courtroom was a place of law and order, not personal sentiment. He had to maintain professionalism. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and called the session to order. Case number 243, State vs. Michael Turner, he announced, his voice steady but quiet in the back of his mind. Michael turned his head slightly, scanning the courtroom as if sensing a familiar presence. He had no idea who the judge was, yet something about the calm authority, the measured voice, and the eyes that seemed to study him with more than usual interest made him uneasy. He felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The bailiff stepped forward, signaling for Michael to stand. The young man straightened his posture as best as he could, trying to hide the tremble in his hands. The public defender, a calm and composed woman named Claire Mitchell, gave him a reassuring nod. Michael nodded back, but his mind was racing. He had never imagined that he would end up in court, facing charges that could change his life forever. Robert, meanwhile, fought to push down the memories that crowded his mind. He remembered the long summer days playing in the park, the school projects they had worked on together, the secret fort they had built behind the old community center. He remembered Michael saving him from a dangerous fall from a tree, the laughter they had shared, and the dreams they had whispered to each other late at night. And now, years later, that same boy stood accused of theft. The prosecution began presenting the case. They spoke of stolen electronics from a local store, of security footage that allegedly showed Michael taking items without paying, and of witnesses who claimed to have seen him leaving the scene. Robert listened carefully, analyzing every detail, every word. He noticed Michael's reaction, the nervous glance at the floor, the way he swallowed hard, and the tiny shakes of his hands. There was something genuine in his nervousness, something that spoke of fear rather than guilt. Michael tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting to the judge. There was something about the man's presence that felt familiar, a subtle warmth in the way he listened that reminded Michael of someone he once knew. He couldn't place it yet, but the feeling made him uneasy. The courtroom, filled with spectators and lawyers, seemed suddenly smaller, more intense, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Robert continued to listen, his mind a careful balance of professional detachment and personal recognition. He could not let his feelings interfere, yet he could not ignore the memories that Michael's presence had stirred. He reminded himself that he had taken an oath to uphold the law, to be fair, to be impartial. But being fair did not mean being cold. It meant seeing the truth, even when it was complicated. The first witness was called, a store employee who claimed to have seen Michael leave with a bag of stolen goods. The employee spoke confidently, pointing to the security footage and describing what happened. Michael's heart sank with each word, but he stayed silent, letting his lawyer handle the questioning. He tried not to let his eyes meet the judge, afraid that some reaction might give away the storm of recognition Robert was feeling. During the questioning, Robert noticed small inconsistencies in the witness's story. The employee described the bag as large, but the footage showed a smaller one. The employee claimed to recognize Michael immediately, but the footage was unclear, making identification uncertain. Robert made a mental note to consider these details carefully. His training and experience allowed him to separate the facts from emotion, yet he could not ignore the human story unfolding before him. As the prosecution wrapped up, Claire, Michael's defender, prepared to speak. She stood confidently, holding her notes and looking directly at the judge. She presented Michael's side calmly and clearly, emphasizing that he had no prior criminal record and that desperation, not intent, had led to this alleged act. She described the hardships Michael faced growing up in a difficult home, struggling with opportunities, and trying to survive in a world that had often been unkind. Robert listened with careful attention. He noted Michael's quiet reactions, how he nodded slightly, how he seemed to take responsibility without exaggerating. There was honesty in the young man, something Robert remembered from their childhood, the same honesty that had made Michael a trustworthy friend. The courtroom was tense, filled with the quiet murmurs of spectators who sensed the unusual tension between judge and defendant. Robert remained calm outwardly, but inside, he felt a mix of emotions: shock, nostalgia, concern, and a deep desire to see justice done not just in law, but in life. Michael's own testimony was coming next. He knew it was a critical moment. The story of his life, his struggles, and the events that led him here would be heard by the judge who, unknowingly to him, had once been his closest friend. Michael felt the weight of the courtroom, the eyes of the public, and the pressure of a future that could change in an instant. Robert, preparing to hear the testimony, reminded himself to remain impartial. Yet the memories of their shared childhood lingered. He thought of the boy who had been full of dreams and laughter and wondered how life had led him to this point. The contrast between who Michael was and who he had become made Robert reflect on the twists of fate, the challenges of life, and the importance of understanding human complexity when delivering justice. As Michael stood to give his testimony, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every eye was on the young man, every ear tuned to his words. Robert adjusted his glasses, looked at the defendant carefully, and prepared himself to listen not just as a judge, but as someone who had once known this boy intimately. The first part of the trial had set the stage for something extraordinary. It was no longer just a case of theft. It had become a story of recognition, memory, and the delicate balance between law and humanity. The audience, unaware of the personal connection unfolding, sensed the tension and awaited the testimony that could change everything. Robert and Michael were connected now in a way that went beyond the courtroom. The shared past lingered in the air like an invisible thread, pulling at both of them, guiding the course of events that would follow. The story of their reunion, the unfolding trial, and the inevitable revelation was just beginning. As the court recessed briefly before Michael's testimony, Robert sat back in his chair, letting out a quiet sigh. He knew the coming moments would be difficult. He knew that life had brought them here for a reason, though he could not yet see the full picture. The courtroom, with its orderly rows, its papers, and its legal formalities, suddenly felt smaller, more personal, more alive with the weight of human connection. Outside, the sunlight was still bright, casting long shadows on the courthouse steps. People walked by, unaware of the extraordinary encounter happening inside. Yet inside, history, friendship, and fate were converging in a way that would shock everyone present, though neither Robert nor Michael fully realized just how much. The courtroom had taken a short break, giving everyone a moment to stretch, whisper, or review notes. Judge Robert Hayes remained seated behind the bench, though he did not rest. His mind was full of memories he could not shake. He leaned slightly forward, hands folded, staring at Michael across the room. He remembered the boy who had once been fearless on the playground, who had climbed trees higher than any other child, and who had laughed louder than anyone he knew. That same boy now stood accused of a crime, looking smaller somehow, though taller, with the burden of life written across his face. Robert could not help but remember the summer they had spent building a treehouse in his backyard. Michael had insisted on carrying the heavy wood planks, saying he was strong enough, while Robert had followed orders and held the nails. They had spent hours together, planning every detail, measuring every beam, and imagining that treehouse as their own secret kingdom. It was a time of laughter, friendship, and trust, simple joys that felt distant now, replaced by the cold formality of the courtroom. He shook his head, trying to focus. This was not about nostalgia. This was about justice. Yet he felt a tug at his heart, knowing that Michael's life had taken difficult turns. He wondered how many times the boy had struggled, how many nights he had gone hungry, how many doors had been closed to him simply because life had not been kind. Judges often saw the worst of people, but rarely did they see someone they had loved and trusted as a child. This case was different. Meanwhile, Michael sat quietly, hands clasped in front of him, glancing occasionally at Claire Mitchell, his public defender. He trusted her completely. She had a calm, reassuring presence that made the courtroom less intimidating. Yet even her words of encouragement could not ease the unease he felt. Something about the judge seemed familiar. The voice was calm, measured, and patient in a way that triggered a sense of recognition in Michael's mind. He could not place it yet, but it made him uneasy. Michael's life had been a series of challenges. He had grown up in a single-parent household, his mother working long hours just to put food on the table. He had often been left to care for his younger siblings, navigating the world without much guidance. School had been difficult, and eventually, he had dropped out, needing to find work to survive. Small mistakes had led to bigger problems, and now he faced serious consequences in a courtroom full of strangers. The public defender, Claire, reviewed her notes one last time before calling Michael to the stand. "You're going to do fine," she whispered, giving him a small, encouraging smile. Michael nodded, drawing in a deep breath to steady himself. He pushed the nerves aside and stood, walking to the witness stand carefully, trying not to trip on the edge of his shoes. Robert observed every step, every small movement, with a sharp eye. The young man's nervousness was obvious, but so was the honesty in his demeanor. Judges often develop an intuition about people, a sense of their character based on small gestures and expressions. Robert felt a strange mixture of pride and concern. This was the boy who had been loyal and courageous, yet life had tested him in ways Robert could never have imagined. Michael took the stand and faced the courtroom. The bright lights made him squint slightly, and the sound of papers shuffling and whispers made him more anxious. He looked at the judge directly for the first time, and though he could not place him, a flicker of familiarity passed through his mind. Something about the eyes, the calm authority, and the way the man listened made him pause. The moment was brief, but it unsettled him. He began to speak, his voice shaky at first. He told the story of his life, his childhood, the hardships he had faced, and the mistakes that had led him here. He spoke honestly, acknowledging that he had made a poor decision. He explained that he had never intended to harm anyone, and that desperation had pushed him into a situation he now regretted deeply. Robert listened carefully, weighing every word. He noted Michael's honesty, the remorse in his voice, and the small gestures that revealed sincerity. He remembered that same quality from their childhood: the honesty, the courage, the loyalty. It was all there, even now, despite the years and hardships. The courtroom audience was attentive, sensing the tension but unaware of the personal connection developing. They watched Michael closely, judging for themselves, forming opinions based on his demeanor and words. Some nodded slightly, feeling sympathy; others remained skeptical, waiting for evidence to decide. Michael continued, describing how he had tried to work, how he had looked for opportunities, and how he had hoped to make a better life for himself. He spoke about the support he had received from a few kind neighbors and teachers who had encouraged him, and the people who had let him down. Every word painted a picture of struggle, resilience, and hope, a life shaped by circumstances but not defined by crime. Robert felt a mixture of emotions. He was a judge trained to focus on facts, evidence, and law, but he could not ignore the human story before him. He remembered their shared dreams, the boyhood adventures, and the trust they had placed in one another. He recognized the potential for redemption, the possibility of guiding this young man back onto a positive path. Claire Mitchell, sensing the moment, asked Michael to explain the events of the day of the alleged theft in detail. Michael recounted everything he remembered, from the reason he went to the store to the confusion that led to his arrest. He did not exaggerate or minimize his actions, he simply told the truth as best as he could. The courtroom watched, fascinated by the young man's honesty. Some leaned forward, captivated by the story, sensing that this was not just another trial. Robert observed quietly, noting every detail: the hesitation in Michael's voice, the sincerity in his eyes, and the unmistakable sense of remorse. During the testimony, Robert's mind briefly wandered to their last summer together before high school. He remembered how Michael had helped him study for exams, how they had shared sandwiches during lunch breaks, and how they had laughed at the smallest things. That same kindness and integrity seemed present now, hidden beneath the nervousness and struggles of adulthood. Robert also considered the ethical challenges of this case. Judges are trained to remain impartial, to deliver justice without personal bias. Yet he recognized the humanity in front of him, the life shaped by choices and circumstances, and the potential for growth and change. He reminded himself to let the law guide him, but also to remember that justice was not only about punishment, it was about fairness and opportunity. Michael's testimony ended with a quiet plea. He asked the judge to consider his situation carefully, to see him as more than just a defendant, and to allow him a chance to make amends. His voice, though nervous, carried a sense of hope and sincerity that resonated with everyone in the courtroom. As the session paused for a brief recess, Robert leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the extraordinary coincidence of recognizing his childhood friend on the bench. The courtroom, the witnesses, the evidence, they all mattered, but so did the human connection he could not ignore. He realized that the story unfolding here was larger than any case he had presided over. It was a story of friendship, fate, and the unpredictable ways life brought people together. Michael, in the meantime, sat quietly at the defense table. He felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, sensing that something significant had shifted. He could not yet identify the source of that feeling, but it made him more aware of the judge's presence. He wondered if the man on the bench understood more than he let on, and he felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps there was some unseen chance for understanding and compassion. The courtroom staff prepared for the next part of the trial, arranging documents and briefing the lawyers. Observers murmured quietly, speculating about the young man's story and what the outcome might be. No one noticed the private reflection happening in the judge's mind, the quiet recognition that had turned an ordinary trial into a personal and emotional journey. Robert took a moment to remind himself of his responsibilities. He would listen carefully to the remaining testimony, review the evidence thoroughly, and remain fair and impartial. Yet he could not ignore the connection he felt with Michael, a bond forged in childhood and unexpectedly rekindled in a courtroom years later. As the break ended, everyone returned to their seats. Michael's testimony had left a strong impression, and the next phase of the trial promised to be even more revealing. Robert adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and prepared to guide the proceedings, knowing that the story before him was no longer just a legal matter, it was a journey of recognition, understanding, and the possibility of redemption. The tension in the room was palpable, and the anticipation for what would happen next grew stronger with every passing moment. Both judge and defendant were aware, on some level, that their shared past had changed the course of events. Outside the courtroom, life went on as usual, but inside, a reunion of remarkable coincidence had begun, and the next steps promised to be unforgettable for everyone involved. Part 2 ends here, with the courtroom quiet, the anticipation rising, and the young man's story ready to continue, inching toward a revelation that would shock everyone present. The courtroom was full again after the short recess. The murmurs of the audience slowly faded as the bailiff called everyone to order. The wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward, eager to hear the next part of the case. Judge Robert Hayes adjusted his robe, sat upright, and gave a calm nod to signal the continuation. He looked over at Michael Turner, who was back at the defense table, waiting quietly beside his lawyer. Robert's mind was steady now, though his heart was not. Every time he looked at Michael, memories from decades ago filled his thoughts. He could almost see the boy running through the neighborhood streets, barefoot in the summer, carrying a kite they had built together. He could hear his laughter echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. Yet now, Michael sat accused of a crime, a defendant in his courtroom. Robert knew he had to be careful. Justice was delicate, and his own feelings must not cloud his duty. Still, it was impossible to ignore the pull of recognition. The prosecution stood and began to call another witness. This time, it was the store's manager, a middle-aged man with sharp features and a stiff posture. He walked to the stand and raised his hand to take the oath, his voice steady as he promised to tell the truth. The prosecutor wasted no time, diving straight into questions. "Do you remember the night of the incident?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," the manager replied firmly. "It was late, close to closing time. I saw someone near the electronics aisle. He seemed suspicious, looking around more than usual. A little later, I noticed some items missing, and I believed it was him." The prosecutor pointed to Michael. "Is that the man you saw that evening?" The manager nodded. "Yes, that's him." Michael's stomach dropped. He felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. Claire, his lawyer, remained calm, jotting notes and preparing her questions. She had trained herself to look past the surface of words, searching for gaps and weaknesses in testimony. When it was her turn, Claire rose and walked gracefully to the stand. Her voice was clear but polite. "Sir, you said it was close to closing time. The store was dimly lit, was it not?" "Yes, we don't keep all the lights on near closing," the manager admitted. "And you said you saw someone near the electronics aisle. Did you see him holding anything?" The manager paused. "No, not directly. But items were missing afterward." Claire leaned closer. "So, you didn't actually see this man take anything?" The courtroom grew quiet. The manager hesitated before answering. "No, not directly." A few people in the audience exchanged glances. It was a small but important detail. Robert, from the bench, noticed the hesitation and carefully noted it in his mind. Evidence must be clear, not based on assumption. As the cross-examination continued, Michael felt a flicker of hope. Claire's steady questioning gave him strength. He looked at the judge again and felt something stir inside him. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about Judge Hayes that reminded him of safety, of someone who once mattered in his life. The prosecution tried to strengthen their case with security footage. A grainy video was played on a screen for everyone to see. It showed a figure walking quickly down an aisle, a bag slung over one shoulder. The image was blurry, the face unclear, but the shape and build seemed similar to Michael's. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said confidently, "this footage shows the defendant leaving the store at the exact time items went missing. It is clear evidence of theft." Robert leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the footage. It was difficult to see details. The figure could be Michael, but it could also be someone else of similar build. He noticed how the camera angle distorted the height, how the shadows blurred the features. He remained quiet but made careful notes. When it was Claire's turn, she stood calmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you can see for yourselves. The footage is not clear. The face is blurred, the details hidden in shadows. This could be anyone. The prosecution is asking you to assume it is my client. But in court, we do not rely on assumption, we rely on proof." Her words echoed in the silent courtroom. Robert glanced briefly at Michael, who sat with his head slightly bowed. He could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of fear pressing down. As the trial continued, witnesses came and went. Some gave strong statements, others hesitated under questioning. Every piece of evidence added weight to one side or the other, but none of it felt complete. Robert listened carefully, balancing law and memory, duty and humanity. Inside, he was torn. Part of him wanted to step down, to admit his personal connection, to let another judge handle the case. But another part of him felt that life had brought this moment for a reason. Perhaps he was meant to be here, to see Michael again, to understand his story, and to decide not just with law but with wisdom. Michael, meanwhile, struggled with his own thoughts. As he sat listening to the arguments, flashes of his childhood crept into his mind. He remembered a boy named Robbie, his best friend growing up. Robbie had been kind, always helping him with homework, always sharing his lunch when Michael didn't have any. They had built forts together, played baseball in the street, and dreamed of becoming something great. Could it be? Michael shook the thought away. It was impossible. Life had taken them in different directions. His childhood friend could not be the man sitting on that bench. Still, the thought lingered. The judge's voice carried a calm tone, almost familiar. The way he studied Michael with quiet intensity felt like more than formality. Michael wanted to know, but he dared not ask. This was not the place. By late afternoon, the courtroom felt heavy with tension. The prosecution had presented all their evidence. The defense had done their best to counter each point. Now, the judge announced that the trial would continue the next day with closing arguments. The courtroom began to empty, people whispering about the case, debating guilt or innocence. Some believed Michael was guilty, others thought the evidence was too weak. But everyone agreed the atmosphere was unusual, almost charged with something unseen. As Robert left the bench, he paused for a moment, glancing once more at Michael. Their eyes met briefly, and in that second, Michael felt the flicker of recognition grow stronger. He almost whispered the name, but the bailiff was already escorting him out. Robert returned to his chambers, exhausted but thoughtful. He sat at his desk, staring at an old photograph on the wall of his office, a picture of him as a child with friends from the neighborhood. And there, standing next to him, was Michael. The photo brought a smile to his lips and a heaviness to his heart. He whispered softly to himself, "Michael Turner. I never thought I'd see you here." The night outside was quiet, but inside the judge's mind, the storm raged on. Tomorrow would bring decisions, revelations, and perhaps the truth both men had been circling around but not yet spoken aloud. The trial was no longer just about theft, it was about fate, friendship, and the extraordinary ways life could bring people back together when they least expected it. The day ended with a feeling that something important was about to unfold. The courtroom might see evidence and arguments, but what lay beneath was a story much deeper, one of recognition, lost friendship, and the possibility of redemption. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with even more people than before. Word had spread about the case, and many had come out of curiosity. The air buzzed with whispers, and the wooden benches creaked under the weight of anticipation. Reporters, curious onlookers, and families of both the store owner and Michael were seated, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Judge Robert Hayes entered the room with his usual calm stride, though inside, his emotions were anything but calm. His robe flowed behind him as he took his seat at the bench. He gave a small nod to the bailiff, who struck the gavel and called the court to order. Silence quickly followed, the kind of silence that carried both respect and suspense. Robert's eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, to Michael. The young man looked tired, his eyes a little red as though he hadn't slept well. He sat beside Claire, his public defender, fidgeting slightly with his hands. Their eyes met for a moment, and Robert quickly looked down at his papers. He could not let his personal feelings show. The day's session was meant for closing arguments. Both the prosecution and defense would make their final cases before Robert made his ruling. But something about the atmosphere felt different. The tension was heavier, as if something important was waiting just beneath the surface. The prosecution began first. The lawyer spoke with confidence, pacing the floor as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "this is not a complicated case. The defendant was seen acting suspiciously in the store. The manager identified him. The footage shows someone of his build leaving at the exact time items went missing. The evidence, though simple, is clear. Theft occurred, and the defendant was responsible. We ask that you deliver justice." His words were strong, rehearsed, and polished. He painted Michael as guilty beyond doubt. The courtroom nodded along, some seemed convinced. Then came the defense. Claire rose gracefully, adjusting her blazer as she faced the judge. "Your Honor, this is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. The witness could not confirm without doubt that my client was the one who stole. The footage is blurry, unclear, and leaves room for error. And most importantly, Michael Turner has no prior record. He is not a criminal by nature. He is a young man who has faced hardships but has always tried to find a better way. This was desperation, not deception. We ask you to see him as a human being, not just a defendant." Her voice rang with conviction. She spoke passionately about fairness, about second chances, about how justice should not be about punishment alone, but about understanding. Robert listened carefully, feeling the weight of her words pressing on his heart. Then, something unexpected happened. Claire turned to Michael. "Your Honor, with your permission, my client would like to say a few final words." Robert hesitated. Normally, at this stage, it was unusual for a defendant to speak again. But something inside him told him to allow it. He nodded gently. "You may speak." Michael stood slowly. His hands trembled slightly, but he steadied himself and looked directly at the judge. His voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger with every sentence. "I know I made mistakes," he began. "I know standing here means I did something wrong. But I want you to understand I never wanted to hurt anyone. My life hasn't been easy. I've struggled, I've fallen, and I've tried to get back up again. Maybe I don't deserve sympathy, but I do want a chance. A chance to prove I can do better." The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. Michael continued, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Sometimes, life pushes you into corners you never wanted to be in. Sometimes, you make choices you regret. But I am not a thief in my heart. I just want to work, to live, to do right. That's all." Robert's chest tightened. He heard not just the words, but the sincerity in them. The voice, the tone, the honesty, it was the same as the boy he had once known. His mind was flooded with images of their childhood, afternoons spent in the park, the day they won a school project together, the night Michael had given him half his sandwich when he forgot his lunch. Without thinking, Robert leaned forward slightly and asked a question that broke every wall of formality. "Michael Turner, is that really you?" The courtroom gasped. Murmurs erupted instantly, people turning to one another in confusion. Michael froze, his eyes widening. He stared at the judge, disbelief written all over his face. "Robbie." Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "Robbie Hayes." The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Claire looked at her client in shock. The prosecutor blinked in confusion. The audience sat up straighter, whispers spreading quickly, "The judge knows the defendant?" Robert's face softened. He couldn't hide it anymore. "Yes, Michael. It's me. We grew up together." The revelation spread through the room like wildfire. Everyone was stunned. The reporters scribbled furiously, the audience gasped, and even the bailiff looked taken aback. The case had suddenly transformed from a theft trial into something far more personal and extraordinary. Michael stood frozen, his hands gripping the wooden edge of the defense table. I can't believe this. All these years, and now here you are." His eyes were glassy with unshed tears. Robert cleared his throat, regaining his professional tone. "This court will maintain order," he said, though his voice carried a gentleness it hadn't before. "Yes, we knew each other as children. But let me assure everyone here I remain committed to fairness. My duty is to justice. Yet, I will not pretend I do not remember who this young man once was." The prosecutor looked uneasy, shifting in his seat. Claire, however, seized the moment. "Your Honor, then you know my client is not defined by this one mistake. You know his character, his heart. That should matter." Michael's emotions overflowed. "Robbie. I mean, Judge Hayes. I never thought I'd see you again. Life took me down a path I couldn't escape. But seeing you here, hearing your voice, it feels like the world is giving me one more chance." The atmosphere was electric. The audience was spellbound, watching a moment that felt more like a story from a book than real life. Two childhood friends, separated by years and circumstances, reunited in the most unlikely place, one as judge, the other as defendant. Robert sat back, breathing deeply. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, heavier than ever. This was not just about law anymore. It was about truth, about fairness, about life itself. He knew that whatever decision he made next would not just affect Michael's future, it would also define his own integrity as a judge and as a man. The session ended with Robert announcing that he would deliver his ruling the next day. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as people left, talking about the shocking revelation. Some doubted Robert could remain impartial, others believed his connection gave him unique insight into Michael's true character. Michael was escorted out, but not before glancing back at Robert one last time. Their eyes met, and for the first time, both men smiled faintly, an unspoken recognition that, despite the years and hardships, the bond of friendship had not completely disappeared. That night, Robert sat alone in his chambers. He stared at the old childhood photo again, the one with Michael standing beside him. He touched the frame gently, whispering to himself, "What am I meant to do, old friend? Justice, or mercy?" The city outside was quiet, but inside the courthouse walls, an extraordinary story was unfolding, one that no one would ever forget. Tomorrow, the decision would be made, and it would shock everyone who heard it. The final day of the trial arrived. The courthouse steps were crowded long before the doors opened. Reporters stood with cameras ready, capturing every movement. Curious citizens filled the sidewalks, whispering about the unusual case. It wasn't every day that a judge recognized a defendant as his childhood friend in open court. Everyone wanted to see how it would end. Inside, The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The benches were packed, and the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and nervous energy. The bailiff called for order, and the murmurs quieted immediately. Judge Robert Hayes entered the room, his face calm but serious. His robe swayed as he walked to his seat, though his steps carried the weight of the decision he was about to make. Robert looked across the room. Michael sat at the defense table, his posture straighter than before. He no longer fidgeted, instead, he looked steady, ready to face whatever came. His lawyer, Claire, gave him an encouraging smile, whispering something that made him nod slowly. On the other side, the prosecutor looked confident, holding his closing notes tightly, prepared to argue for a conviction. But in truth, no one knew what was about to happen. Not the lawyers, not the jury of public opinion seated behind them, and not even Michael himself. Only Robert held the final decision in his hands. The prosecutor spoke first. His words were sharp, polished, and full of certainty. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "the law is clear. A crime was committed. The evidence points to this man. We cannot bend justice for personal sympathy. Theft cannot go unpunished. To allow that would weaken the very system we stand upon." He paused, letting the words sink in, then sat down confidently. Claire rose next. She stood tall, her voice calm but full of strength. "Your Honor, the law is indeed clear. But justice is not about punishment alone, it is about fairness, truth, and humanity. The evidence is weak, uncertain, and based on assumption. My client has no record. He has faced hardships that few of us can imagine, yet he still hopes for a chance to do better. This is not the story of a criminal. This is the story of a man who stumbled but can rise again." Her words touched many in the room. Some nodded, others murmured softly, sensing the emotion in her plea. Then, silence fell. All eyes turned to Robert. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on him. He sat quietly for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench. The air was so still that even the faint ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard. Finally, Robert spoke. His voice was steady, but everyone could sense the gravity behind his words. "I have listened carefully to the arguments. I have reviewed the evidence. And I have thought deeply about the responsibility of this position. It is true I know the defendant. We grew up together. That fact cannot be hidden. But it is also true that my duty is to the law, to justice, and to fairness. And so, I must weigh everything carefully." The audience leaned forward, not wanting to miss a word. Robert continued, his eyes on Michael. "The evidence presented by the prosecution is not without doubt. The witness did not see the defendant take anything directly. The footage, though presented as proof, is unclear. It leaves room for uncertainty. In law, we cannot convict on assumption. We require certainty. And here, that certainty does not exist." Murmurs spread instantly through the courtroom. The prosecutor frowned, flipping through his notes in frustration. Claire placed a hand gently on Michael's arm, her face calm but relieved. But Robert was not finished. He leaned slightly forward, his voice deep and thoughtful. "Michael Turner, you are not free of responsibility. Even if desperation led you to this path, choices have consequences. But punishment is not only about confinement. Sometimes, punishment must be about learning, about rebuilding, about giving someone a chance to find their way again." Michael's eyes glistened as he listened. The room was silent again, every ear waiting for the decision. "Therefore," Robert said firmly, "I will not send you to prison. Instead, I am sentencing you to community service, counseling, and a mentorship program. You will work to give back to the community you once took from. You will learn, you will rebuild, and you will prove that your words are true, that you can do better." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few claps filled the air. Some people were shocked, others moved. The prosecutor looked frustrated but said nothing. He knew the judge's decision was final. Claire smiled, her shoulders relaxing with relief. Michael could not hold back his tears. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking as emotion poured out of him. When he finally looked up, his voice trembled. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Robbie." The use of the childhood name caught the audience's attention again. The bond between judge and defendant was no longer just rumor, it was real, and it had shaped the outcome in a way no one expected. Robert gave a small nod, his face softening. "Don't thank me, Michael. Thank the chance life has given you. Use it well." The gavel struck. Court is adjourned. The audience rose, buzzing with conversation, stunned by what they had witnessed. The story would spread beyond the courthouse, carried through newspapers and word of mouth. People would talk about the case for years, the day a judge recognized his childhood friend on trial and chose redemption over punishment. Outside the courtroom, Michael was released into Claire's care, no longer bound by the heavy shadow of prison. Reporters swarmed, but he ignored them, his mind fixed on one thing. He turned and saw Robert stepping down the courthouse steps, his robe flowing in the breeze. For a moment, they looked at each other across the crowd. Michael walked toward him, hesitant at first, then stronger with each step. When they finally stood face to face, neither spoke for a moment. The world around them faded, the cameras, the reporters, the crowd all blurred into the background. Finally, Michael spoke softly. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life." Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "No, Michael. You will save your own life. This is your second chance. Don't waste it." Michael nodded, tears in his eyes. "I won't. I promise." For the first time in years, both men smiled at each other, not as judge and defendant, but as friends reunited by fate. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Robert sat alone in his home, reflecting on the day. He knew he had walked a fine line between law and personal history, but he also knew he had made the right decision. Justice was not just about punishment, it was about fairness, humanity, and hope. And somewhere in the city, Michael began his new chapter, determined to honor the second chance he had been given. He thought of the boyhood friend who had once shared a treehouse and a dream, and who had now shared something even greater, mercy. The story ended not with punishment, but with hope, a reminder that sometimes the most shocking thing in a courtroom is not a conviction, but compassion.